Hello, my name is Caitlin, and I'm one of the librarians at the Saratoga Springs Public Library. When I'm not at the library, there are two things I really love to do: sew historical clothing and travel. I especially love to combine them if I can, and it's an added bonus if I can bring pieces of my hobby life into my library life. So while we're all at home, the library has been trying to find ways to bring you exciting digital content to enrich the lives of our patrons. So to that end, I'm bringing you this program today that I hope is a little escapist, a little bit encouraging when it comes to your hobbies, and hopefully really interesting. This is the story of how I made a Victorian ball gown and took my first trip around the UK, all because I wanted to attend a ball in Bath. So, how did this start? There's a historical costumer in the UK who I've been following since before I ever started stitching my own costumes. Her name is Isabella, and she and her husband were actually recently featured on BBC News because they've been doing costumed constitutionals around their village during quarantine. And back in 2016 or so, Isabella began hosting an annual Victorian ball at the historic Bath Assembly Rooms, that the same assembly rooms that played host to several Jane Austen heroines and where they filmed parts of the 1995 Persuasion movie. A few days after Isabella's 2017 ball, she posted the date for the next one and the ticket sales on her Facebook. When I saw it, I looked at my partner and I asked, "So, do you want to go to a ball in Bath, England next year?" He shrugged and he said, "Sure." So, it was time to start planning. The first thing I did was actually book the hotel in Bath for the weekend of the ball because I knew that those would sell out as we got closer to the date. I also had to figure out an itinerary. Originally, I thought of starting in Edinburgh and then traveling to London and then finishing in Bath, but when I started looking into it, the flights cost almost $200 more per person to fly into Edinburgh, and there were no direct flights, so it would be 12 to 15 hours of travel. Instead, the flight from JFK to London was only about $400 per person, and it was only a 7-hour flight. So I booked the flights through kayak.com on an airline called Finnair, but it was serviced by British Airways, so we had a British Airways 777 plane and a crew. Booking the London and Edinburgh hotels was a little bit harder. I started by trying to find hotels in the areas that I wanted to stay and booking directly on the hotel's websites, but their websites kept rejecting either the format of my credit card number or the format of my billing zip code. So I finally just ended up booking through hotels.com, and it was so much easier and simpler. I should have just tried to do that from the start. One thing about the hotel that we stayed in London, it was called The Hub by Premier Inn, and it might be fine for a single business traveler, but they have this weird things with the bathrooms where the bathrooms are sort of just glass walls with openings at the top and bottom. So there's really no privacy, and it was a little awkward even for a couple. So that's just a note about those. But our hotel in Edinburgh, the Apex Grass Market, was really nice, and they gave us a free rubber ducky when we checked in. Then we were on to the the rail passes to travel between cities. I put my partner in charge of the train tickets because he is into trains, so I figured that was a good aspect for him to take charge of. And we were going to be traveling from London to Edinburgh, and then Edinburgh to Bath, and then back to London. The tickets were a bit more expensive than I thought they were going to be, but my partner found this two together rail discount card, which was designed for two travelers who would be traveling together for their whole trip. He had to apply for the card, take our photos for ID, and then submit the application and wait for it to be approved. But it saved us at least $100 total, and I think the total for our train tickets for the whole round trip ended up being about $300. And then the day that we were actually supposed to leave for the trip, I got an email that our flight was canceled. So I went on the Finnair website and saw that there was another flight the same night that was going to London, and it was half an hour later than ours was supposed to leave, and that flight was not full yet, which is probably why they canceled our flight in the first place. I called Finnair customer service and they put me on hold for half an hour, and the agent I talked to came off very sort of clipped and cold sounding. But after being on hold for half an hour, she just came back on the phone and said, "Okay, you're all set. I emailed you the new flight reservation." So it was actually really efficient and painless. And another note about traveling out of JFK, my partner has family on Long Island. So when we fly out of JFK, we drive down to Long Island, park at his family's house, and then they drop us off at the LIRR train station, and then we take the train into JFK. So that's how we fly out of JFK. It might be different, obviously, for people that don't have family down there. Um, but that's how we're able to do it, and we find it really efficient and inexpensive. But before we could get to that point, because we were going to a ball, I obviously had to make a dress. I don't remember how I ended up settling on the color pink because I was doing so much research into dresses of the era. And at one point, I know I was considering lavender, but after spending hours going through fashion plates, gathering ideas, and looking at what fabrics were available, I ended up on pink. And since the theme of the ball was the natural form era, which is this weird little time period between about 1876 and 1883 when the dresses got narrower and closer to the body, that was the era that I was looking at. And during this time, when women didn't use big hoop skirts or bustles, they would maybe just use a bit of padding at the hips, and then they would have these long, heavily trimmed trains on their gown, especially on their evening wear. So that was what I was looking at. And for my patterns, I used a book called Fashions of the Gilded Age by Frances Grimble. I actually borrowed a copy of this set of books from through interlibrary loan at my library first to make sure it had what I needed. And then once I knew that volume 2 had the evening wear and ball gowns, I went out and purchased my own copy. And what Fashions of the Gilded Age does is it reprints original Victorian patterns with some measurements and basic construction instructions. So I had to trace my pattern onto grid paper and then scale it up from there. I then had to cut my pattern pieces out in cheap fabric and test the fit over my Victorian corset. And I'll be honest, looking back at this now, I did not do a great job on the fit. I think the waist on this pattern was a bit too short on me, which is something I should have caught in this mock-up phase, but it was my first time drafting a pattern this complex from a book, and I did the best I could with my skills and knowledge I had at the time. Now I would probably be able to fit it a bit better. This is the cutout bodice pieces, which I then interlined with cotton twill to give it strength. Here's the major bodice pieces sewn together. This is so that you can see the interlining inside and the seams. Many Victorian bodices left their seams sort of half finished like this on the inside. They would either whip stitch the seam allowance or bind the raw edges with a narrow ribbon. I just left mine raw because I was in a bit of a rush. For the underskirt, I used a natural form era skirt pattern that I had used before. It's 2 layers, a white cotton lining, and then the pink silk fashion fabric. It's got a tie behind the knees to keep the volume of the skirt and the train toward the back, so you get that long trailing look in the era. I also had to add a ruffled train to my petticoat. This serves 2 functions. It gives volume to the skirt train and keeps it fluffy, but it also helps keep the train out of the dirt. It's much easier to wash this cotton layer than it is to clean the delicate silk on top. I meant to add buttons and buttonholes to the train to make it easier to take off, to clean, and put back on again. But again, at the time I was rushed, so I kind of just quickly whip stitched it on. And because I'm still a bit lazy, I never did put the buttons on, so now I still have to cut the stitches and resew it every time I need to put it on or take it back off. Then I added the draping overskirt. This layer is just the pink silk, it doesn't have a liner, and it's from a pattern in Fashions of the Gilded Age. And I finished the edges of the bodice with piping, which is a really common technique in the era. In this photo, you can see I put boning on the seams of the bodice. This helps the bodice to sit smoothly over the corset. And then I turned up the edges of the bodice behind the piping on the edge and whip stitch them down. To close the back of the bodice, I created 2 strips out of cotton twill with grommets and whip stitched them securely onto the back. I use a pink ribbon to lace it closed, but I do need an assistant to get it tight enough in the back that you can't really see the lace. For the trim around the neckline, I had to sort of invent this as I went, and unfortunately I didn't take photos of the process because I wasn't sure if it was going to work. So this is from my Instagram stories, which is why it has text on it. I used an off-white chiffon that I gathered and put over a pink base piece. And earlier in the 19th century, this piece is often referred to as a bertha, but I'm not actually sure if that term was still being used for it in the 1880s. And then I finished the edge of the trim by adding some lace that I had left over from a different project. And to my surprise and relief, it actually looked really good. And here's what it looks like finished. This is on my duct tape dress form, which was made to my size. And you can see I also added pleated trim to the bottom of the underskirt to add a bit of texture and interest. And here's the side and the back. And then here you can see what the bodice looks like when it's lace closed in the back. I finished the dress about 2 or 3 weeks before our trip because we were actually also going away for a long weekend at the beginning of that same month. So I had to get it done before then. And then, before the trip, it was time to pack. My pretty pink dress folded up in the suitcase. So our flight left JFK at about 8 p.m. and we arrived in London at 7 a.m. London time. And the first thing we did was go to our hotel to ask if it were possible to store our luggage there until check-in time because we didn't want to be pulling our wheeled luggage around the city all day. Luckily, they had a room open and they let us check in right then, so we were able to put our stuff in our room. And then we desperately needed breakfast. So we walked over to this cute restaurant called Bill's in Covent Garden. It had windows that opened on a courtyard and eclectic decor and really good food. And it was super refreshing to sit down to some tea, eggs, and toast after that overnight flight. Then we just started walking around. These pictures show the famous Horse Guards on Whitehall Street and the Triple Arch Bridge over King Charles Street nearby. Unfortunately, while we were there, the Houses of Parliament and Big Ben were under construction and covered in scaffolding, so we couldn't really get a good view. You'll also notice in this picture that orange barrier in the front. We actually arrived on the day of the London Marathon without realizing that was going on that day. We saw a few of the racers in the wheelchair leg of the marathon go by as we stood by this barrier, and it was actually really hot that day. Apparently 2018 was the hottest London Marathon ever, so it was quite hot and we were surprised how well the racers were doing. They looked uncomfortable. Here's Big Ben covered in scaffolding. Here is Westminster Abbey, which is right nearby, and there's a picture of me and my partner here as proof that we were there, and I'm not just showing you photos that I pulled off the internet. And on this day, we also went to the National Portrait Gallery. The great thing about England's national museums is that they're all free admission, so you can go to as many as you want. There is usually a little booth or a stand near the entrance asking for donations if you can, but otherwise you don't have to pay admission. There's no set admission fee. My favorite thing to see in these museums is the old portraits because you can see really great clothes and they're usually really, really big portraits, so you can get a lot of the details that you can't get from like scans of them that you find online. At the National Portrait Gallery, I particularly loved this portrait that I found called John Wilkes and his daughter Mary because I just loved her pink dress with the green petticoat and the little dog sitting at her feet. This photo was taken from the Golden Jubilee Bridge over the River Thames. You can see the London Eye on the left, Westminster Bridge is toward the background, and Big Ben is over on the right, framed by the barge cranes with all the scaffolding on it. Here's a closer photo of Westminster Bridge and Big Ben. This is in Whitehall Gardens, and this is a big, gorgeous old building that I'm not sure what it was originally, but now it just has offices and event space, I guess. Here's a nice little view just from walking along the Victoria Embankment. Here's Trafalgar Square at sunset. That building with all the columns is the National Gallery. And here's another view of Trafalgar Square. The next morning, we were walking through Hyde Park when we happened upon this contingent of horse guards practicing maneuvers. And so we just kind of stood there for a while watching them because they were doing different sort of lineups and maneuvers and things. Here's another, like, to prove I was there kind of photo. The cherry blossoms were blooming in Hyde Park when we were there, and a raven came down to check me out while I was standing there kind of playing with some of the blossoms that had fallen in the grass. And then we went to the Victoria and Albert Museum, where I got to stare at some gorgeous original garments. The one on the left here is from the late Victorian era, probably somewhere around the 1890s. The one on the right is a Regency era pelisse, so from sometime early in the 19th century. We then took the tube over to the Tower of London. I wasn't sure at first if we were going to go in because I'd heard sometimes you have to wait in line for a long time to get in, and then once you do get in, it can be really crowded inside. But when we got there, the line at the entrance was really short, so we decided to go in. Here's a photo from within the grounds of the Tower of London looking out over the River Thames. This is the view of Tower Bridge from the grounds of the tower. And this is the White Tower on the grounds where this building stores the royal armories. And I actually really enjoyed looking around the site. I thought it might be a little touristy, but there's actually such a sense of history on the grounds, and there's so much to see in there. We probably could have stayed for longer, but honestly, at some point, our brain just started to get oversaturated, so we had to go do something else. So from there, we walked over to this little tucked away park that's called St. Dunstan in the East. It's this little park surrounded by the ruins of this Gothic church. And it's just a really cool spot because it's in the middle of the city, but this church was obviously amazing and nature has just been able to take it over again. So it feels like a completely different world right in the middle of the city and right near the financial district. This is Leadenhall Market, which was a Victorian shopping arcade with really cool architecture. It's now full of restaurants and stores. And after dinner, we were just kind of wandering around, admiring the architecture. This is outside the Royal Courts of Justice. There's all these just really cool Gothic arches. And here's one of the entrances to the Royal Courts of Justice. So the next morning, we went to King's Cross Station in London to take the train up to Edinburgh. And at King's Cross, they have this little platform 9 3/4 photo spot set up for Harry Potter fans. And they also have an official Harry Potter store right in the station. While we were on the train, tried to take some photos of the English countryside, but it's really hard to do from a moving train. All I can really tell you is that I highly recommend taking the train through the English countryside because you just see a lot of really gorgeous rolling hills, fields full of flowers, cool little towns, things like that. I highly recommend. Then we arrived in Edinburgh, and the first thing we realized is that Edinburgh is really hilly. I didn't realize this just by looking at a map, but we got off the train, left the train station, and realized we had to walk up this very steep, winding street to try to get over to our hotel. So it was really interesting trying to drag wheeled suitcases from the train station across the city. This is a shot of St. Giles Cathedral, which sits on the Royal Mile. The Royal Mile is this long series of streets that sits on top of a kind of spine of rock that runs through the middle of Edinburgh. I could honestly just show you photos of Edinburgh all day because almost the whole city just looks like a castle. The building on the right with the spire is an old Victorian church that's now a cafe and a meeting space because they have so many old buildings in Edinburgh that that's what they become. They become cafes when they used to be a church. This is Edinburgh Castle at sunset. Here are some of the buildings out in front of the castle. And this is on the Royal Mile the next morning. This is the view of Edinburgh Castle from the front of our hotel. This is what we saw, like upon leaving the hotel, there's the castle right there. This is Princes Street Gardens, which is a slope that goes down from the castle. The whole hillside was covered in daffodils while we were there. Here's more castle views. See, I could just show you photos of this all day long. One of the coolest things we did while we were in Edinburgh is we paid to take a tour of this historic location called Mary King's Close. It's this medieval street that was covered over with buildings, but like the street itself still exists beneath the buildings. And the tour takes you through the history of the street and some of the people that lived there. It's got a couple ghost stories. It has an explanation of the plague. It was really cool. It was kind of spooky. It was very historic, really interesting tour. Highly recommend it. We also went to Greyfriars Kirkyard, which is an old cemetery in Edinburgh. And in the kirkyard, I found the grave of Thomas Riddell, who supposedly this grave is the inspiration for Lord Voldemort's real name, Thomas Riddle. This is another Harry Potter reference if you're not familiar. This is a view of Edinburgh from the castle walls. And my partner one morning decided to get up at sunrise to go take photos. Sunrise in Edinburgh is at about 1 a.m. New York time in April, which is when we were there. So he went to take photos. I stayed in bed. But after just a couple days in Edinburgh, it was time to take the train yet again, back to Bath this time. So this is Bath Abbey. It was quite rainy that day, as you can probably see. The building on the right is the Roman Baths, which is a historic site and the location of the famous Pump Rooms, which was the setting of many a Regency drama. And of course, one of the first things I had to do while we were there was visit the Bath Fashion Museum. It's underneath the Bath Assembly Rooms, and it's not terribly big, but they have some items dating back to the 1600s, which includes this jacket on the left. And they have items dating all the way up until modern times too. We had tea service in the pump rooms. This was something that I made reservations for probably about a month before our trip. I wanted to make sure that we could get in there to have real tea at least once on our trip. So I made that reservation far in advance, and all the food looks really tiny, but it's all really filling. It was delicious. And then we toured the Roman baths. At first, I wasn't sure how interesting it would be and like how much there would be to see and do on the tour. But when you go in and pay your admission, you can get an audio guide that walks you through the museum and it explains the Roman history of the era and it explains how the springs were piped into the bathhouse. And it was all just really interesting, really well done, really well produced audio tour. So I highly recommend it. And this open bath area, that's probably one of the most famous images of the city of Bath, is actually really cool in person. Like in the pictures, yeah, it looks cool. In person, it's actually much cooler than I thought it would be. This is just some photos around Bath. I really liked it because where London and Edinburgh definitely felt like major international cities with lots of tourists and very crowded, Bath is more of a resort town, like kind of like Saratoga is. So it was less crowded and it felt more sort of British, whereas London to me kind of just felt like New York City with a British accent sometimes. More scenes around Bath. This is another view of Bath Abbey. And then on Saturday night, it was time for the ball. Luckily, our hotel was just a 5-minute walk from the assembly rooms. That was something I did on purpose. And it was raining all day, but luckily, by the time it was time for the ball, it was not raining, so we didn't have to worry about the rain on the walk over. We got ready in the hotel. We got some Wagamama takeout for dinner to hold us over until we got there to eat. Here is Dan and I all ready to go. Dan's tux is actually just a modern tuxedo from Sears because tailoring is not something that I have enough experience with to make something like this. And also, menswear hasn't changed a ton over the last 2 centuries. So we just got him a modern tux, which was acceptable for the dress code for the ball. And here's the room full of dancers in Victorian attire. There's some people dancing in their fancy dresses. This is me with my Instagram friend Naomi. We had talked a few times on Instagram, but this was actually the first time that we had ever met in person. Here's a selfie of us in our fancy clothes. This is a photo of Dan and I from the official ball photographer. And Dan took this photo of the back of my dress in front of this big fireplace. And this is also from the official ball photographer. This is the entire group of people that came to the ball, or at least the ones that were still there at the close of the ball. So after the ball, actually the very next day, we took the train from Bath back to Gatwick Airport. And even though our train was late the next morning, we still ended up getting to Gatwick Airport probably 3 hours before our flight. So we kind of just hung out there and ate lunch. One thing that I learned from this trip is that if I travel internationally for another event like this, I'm going to put the event at the beginning of the trip and then do all of the traveling after the trip. Um, because on this trip, by the time we got to the day of the ball, I was so kind of worn out. I almost didn't feel like getting dressed up for the ball. And also, it was kind of disappointing to just like get on the plane the next day and fly home. I wish I had a couple more days to stay there and kind of hang out. And like some people went back to the pump rooms to get tea the next day, so I would have liked to do that. So just things I have in mind for next time. And speaking of next time, what can I possibly do next? Well, remember that painting of John Wilkes and his daughter Mary from the National Portrait Gallery? I actually, the summer after we went to this Victorian ball, I bought a pair of pink 18th century shoes that are on the right. And just recently, as in last month, I bought the fabric that you see on the left there. So now I have the fabric and the shoes. I just need an event to wear this gown to, once I make it. Lastly, here's my last little photo that I took in Paddington Station on our way back to Gatwick Airport, just because that's kind of a famous station because of Paddington the bear. So I hope you found this interesting and enjoyable. I hope it inspires you to either go work on sewing or go plan your next trip. And I hope it was a little bit of escapism for you today. All right, everyone be well, and our librarians will see you again soon.